Another day, more tomfoolery. Or should I say, puffery. Hello, my fam. It is Perez, the queen of all media, the original influencer, and still your number one source for everything It Ends With Us saga. This judge has let his court become a circus. I should know. I was a part of it. Just minutes ago, the soon-to-be redacted, hopefully, Blake Lively, not literally. I just had a Steve Sarowitz moment. Let's try this again. Just minutes ago, the soon-to-be redacted wactress filed a memorandum of law in further support of motion for spoliation sanctions. And also minutes ago, not coincidentally, the wicked witch Stephanie Jone, Justin Baldoni's fired publicist, filed her own memorandum of law in further support of motion for spoliation sanctions. If this judge was managing his court and the docket as he should, he would have shut this down already. But no, here we are. The redactionista already filed with the court a fully briefed spoliations motion. Sanctions! And so did Stephanie Jone. But guess what? P.S. We've got more to add. Why don't we take a listen to what the subpoena superstar has to say? You know who took the lead on this? Ethically challenged Ezra. She says, quote, starting off without any foreplay, getting right to it. In their opposition to their motion for sanctions, spoliation, in their opposition, defendants admit that they took no steps to preserve ephemeral communications prior to December 20th, 2024. Pause. Because they weren't required to. Y'all didn't put them on notice until December. Sucks for you. Seems like some bad lawyering. And now, they argue, defendants admit they took no steps to preserve ephemeral communications prior to December 20th, 2024, and that these communications have been irretrievably destroyed. Okay, pause. Achy Blakey's very mid-lawyer is talking about those signal chats, and yes, some of them might be gone, but I remember seeing plenty signal chats. Weren't some of them from August of 2024? Or am I misremembering things? Ezra continues. The ephemeral communications facilitated a means by which defendants could speak quickly, candidly, and most importantly, covertly. As Melissa Nathan acknowledged, when we send over documents, we can't send over the work we will or could do because that could get us in a lot of trouble. None of defendants' excuses for their failure to preserve pass muster. First, defendants' argument that they anticipated litigation only as to Miss Lively's harassment claims, but not retaliation, is entirely disingenuous and plainly wrong on the facts and the law. It ignores the fact that in the November 9th, 2023 protections document, Miss Lively cautioned Wayfarer against retaliation in its many possible forms, including changes in attitude, sarcasm, marginalization, or other negative behavior, either on set or otherwise, including during publicity and promotional work, and warned such conduct would be met with immediate action. Action is bolded and italicized. Instead of heeding this warning, defendants treated it like a roadmap and promptly set about retaliation in each of the ways described. Y'all, I know that Ezra and everybody in her office watch my videos. This is just tomfoolery, puffery, showmanship. This is as much for the media as it is for the saga observers who are passionately watching every day. And this is for me. This is for me. This is about retaliation. What we have been discussing a lot over the last few days. Ezra, I see you. She continues, the protections document, which each defendant received, along with others referenced in the motion, provided as much notice of potential litigation on the issue of retaliation as it did harassment. I love when they tell on themselves. The fact that it's almost 2026 and we're here is because of retaliation and not any alleged non-existent SH. SH that was so bad that the zero-time Oscar-nominated actress and her husband had labeled him a predator. Remember? Second, says Ezra, in a cynical attempt to benefit from their own misconduct, defendants argue that Miss Lively has failed to demonstrate the contents of the destroyed ephemeral communications. But Rule 37E does not require such a showing, nor could it, since it would enable bad actors to avoid liability for their wrongdoing by using their own destructive activities as a shield. Obviously, the contents cannot be demonstrated because they were destroyed. That's the whole point. Third, defendants argue that Miss Lively has not suffered prejudice because she noted there is substantial evidence of retaliatory conduct, and as such, the lost communications would be unnecessarily cumulative. Duplicitous. Unnecessary. They already got it other ways. But, they continue, defendants ignore their own repeated and loud proclamations that they did nothing to further any digital campaign and were only monitoring. If unchecked, they could describe this monitoring in whatever way they want, safe from the risk of impeachment by contrary documentary evidence, having conveniently destroyed it. This is textbook prejudice, which can only be mitigated by a limiting instruction. Finally, defendants' argument that they lacked the requisite intent ignores each of their own admissions that they anticipated litigation no later than August 2024 and took no steps to preserve these destroyed communications. Okay, pause. And this is what's going to upset some of the Team Justin people. I'm Team Truth. By August of 2024, they were already talking to lawyers. The Wayfair parties knew that litigation was very likely. They've admitted that themselves. So it would seem sensible, even though they weren't put on notice, that the lawyers they spoke to would have told them, you should start preserving documents. But maybe not. They had not officially retained Brian Friedman until December of 2024. Back to their document, they anticipated litigation no later than August 2024 and took no steps to preserve these destroyed communications. In fact, defendants confirmed that at any point, Signal chats could have been preserved with the flick of a switch. Their decision not to was deliberate, and the very reason they used Signal, warranting severe sanctions. No. But let's hear them out. Ezra says, the undisputed record confirms each defendant had a duty to preserve ephemeral communications and no reasonable steps were taken. Defendant's opposition to the spoliation sanctions motion confirms they took no steps to preserve their ephemeral communications. Instead, they argue that they had no duty to preserve. This argument not only ignores Second Circuit precedent, but also Miss Lively's unrebutted evidence. Evidence, you say? Okay, I'm all ears. Among other things, defendants do not dispute and therefore concede that Wayfarer, It Ends With Us movie, Baldoni, Sarwitz, Heath, and Abel received the protections document in November 2023, and that the protections document constituted a demand letter for preservation purposes. The mistress of misrepresentation has done it again. They did not concede that that was putting them on notice. I remember reading their opposition. They did not concede that at all, Ezra. She says, defendants also do not dispute that in their written interrogatory responses, they admitted that litigation was possible in or around mid-August 2024. These admissions confirm that by no later than mid-August 2024 and as early as November 2023, a duty to preserve was triggered. There's a footnote here. At several points in their opposition, defendants boldly claim that their agreement to the protection resolved the issues that had arisen during Phase 1 and eliminated the threat of potential litigation. They did. They remedied and stopped everything that she brought up. Did they not? Ezra says, though, these claims are not supported by any facts or evidence and are plainly undermined by the underlying allegations in the present matter. We resume. A duty to preserve was triggered. None of this is contested by defendants. Rather, the crux of their argument rests on the dubious assertion that the only litigation that could have been anticipated in August 2024 involved Lively's objections in Phase 1. I agree with that, which somehow excuses them from any preservation obligations. This argument is simply baseless. First, defendants' contention that their duty to preserve was limited only to Miss Lively's harassment claims finds no legal support. In fact, they cite no authority for this extremely narrow interpretation of the duty to preserve, nor could they. Courts within this circuit have repeatedly recognized that this duty is a broad concept that applies to all relevant documents, which in this case would clearly encompass Miss Lively's retaliation claims. Second, any actions taken in response to the protections document and communications relating to the anticipated plaintiff, Miss Lively, should have been preserved. Illustrating this point, during a July 25th, 2024 meeting between TAG and Wayfarer, specifically defendant Heath and Tara Hanks, Wayfarer discussed, among other things, they discussed redacted By July 2024, defendants were still discussing Miss Lively's harassment claims, now in the context of a crisis PR strategy designed to proactively prevent defendants Baldoni and Heath from being redacted. And because retaliation was plainly an issue that defendants were warned would be the subject of any litigation, no. They cannot now pretend they did not understand that in the midst of undertaking the precise retaliatory conduct about which they had been warned. In fact, they understood the risks perfectly well, which is why they repeatedly stressed the need to avoid putting things in writing, and further why they moved to signal, to cover their tracks and avoid creating a litigation record. Finally, defendants argue that there is no evidence that prior to December 20th, 2024, Nathan, the crisis communication expert, had reason to anticipate litigation involving her crisis management activities on behalf of the Wayfarer defendants. This argument ignores the fact that by early June 2024, Wayfarer was assembling a timeline doc of each alleged incident that involved Miss Lively, as well as zingers intended to attack Miss Lively's reputation. This document, which is effectively a litigation roadmap, was provided to Tag, Abel, and Nathan on July 31st, 2024. The Tag defendants were aware of Miss Lively's harassment claims by June 17th, 2025. I think Ezra made a mistake with the date there. It literally says 2025. When the Tag defendants received a copy of the protections document, and no later than July 25th, 2024, redacted, the Tag defendants themselves acknowledged that litigation was anticipated by mid-August 2024 and knew that they needed to cover their tracks. And the Tag defendants were responsible for facilitating meetings with Mr. Friedman, the lawyer, when litigation was forthcoming. Ignoring all relevant context, defendants argue that there is not a whit of evidence that the war referenced by Miss Nathan was linked to Lively's discrimination claims. But defendants omit from their papers that this reaction to go to war was made in response to Miss Lively's request that defendants Baldoni, Heath, and Wayfarer request. It was a demand. It was not a request. That defendants Baldoni, Heath, and Wayfarer issue a public statement apologizing for their misconduct on set, which followed a vicious and viral online hate campaign directed not just at Miss Lively, but other female cast members, that was confounding given the film's remarkable box office success. The undisputed record establishes that each defendant used Signal and that ephemeral communications once existed. Defendants attempted to pass blame onto Miss Lively for purportedly failing to demonstrate that defendants deleted Signal chats evidencing that they executed the public relations crisis management strategy. But defendants' argument on this score turns Rule 37's standard on its head. Miss Lively is not required to provide the contents of the communications defendants destroyed, but only their existence. There is overwhelming proof that defendants spoliated communications. Each defendant admitted in interrogatory responses to using Signal to discuss, among other things, the digital campaign, Miss Lively, Mr. Reynolds, or the film. Further, the Wallace parties admitted to the existence of these communications and further explained that by operation of Signal's auto-deletion settings, any potentially responsive messages were deleted as a matter of course. This court has already found that it is undisputed that the Wayfarer parties used Signal to discuss topics relevant to this litigation. Discovery has only bolstered this court's prior finding. In party productions, documents were produced demonstrating the creation and use of Signal threads to discuss issues relating to the retaliatory campaign as early as August 7th, 2024. And at their respective depositions, defendants Heath, Nathan, and Abel each testified to using Signal during the relevant period of time. Footnote: as for Baldoni, he testified that he used Signal to talk to a support group prior to December 2024. But the evidence in this case has shown that he sent texts to his support group directly about the harassment allegations in November 2023 and January 2024 at minimum. It defies reason to suggest that he was talking with a support group in the fall of 2024 on Signal in the height of this dispute and never once discussed Lively. Because if he would have, it would have needed to be revealed that he did that. And he says he didn't. Ezra continues. These facts that all the defendants, except for Baldoni, testified to using Signal during the relevant time period, these facts render the entire laundry list of cases cited by defendants inopposite, each of which turned on the movement's failure to demonstrate the purportedly spoliated documents even existed ex ante. Ex ante, the term is a new Latin phrase meaning before the event. Okay. As a result of all of this, defendant spoliation has prejudiced Miss Lively. The evidence shows that defendants, along with the Wallace parties, turned to Signal in or around mid-August 2024 at the latest, at the same time the digital campaign was underway. I was right! The few documents that were preserved and produced by the Wallace parties illustrate their abilities to, among other things, manipulate social media engagements and website traffic for clients, as well as how easily they were able to conceal their hand in those efforts. That the key ephemeral communications, including those with the Wallace parties, were not preserved establishes clear prejudice to Miss Lively and deprives her of the ability to test and rebut the counter-narratives that defendants have continued to advance. In their opposition, defendants do not address the examples of prejudice identified by Miss Lively. Instead, they focus on the substantial evidence referenced in the opening brief and argue that this somehow rebuffs the notion of prejudice. Footnote: defendants improperly shift the burden to Miss Lively to demonstrate prejudice. However, it is well settled that it is not plaintiff's burden to prove prejudice. Again, defendants miss the point. they have compromised Miss Lively's ability to rebut and refute defendants' defenses. This is especially so with respect to their assertion that the only work they were doing is monitoring, which courts, including this court, have recognized as establishing prejudice. Miss Lively has been deprived of the digital trail that would allow her to test, counter, and contextualize defendants' insistence that they did nothing other than monitoring. Finally, relying upon Rule 403 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, defendants argue there is no prejudice since the ephemeral communications that they failed to preserve would be needlessly cumulative. But the loss of needlessly cumulative evidence in and of itself supports a finding of prejudice. Footnote: defendants' reliance upon the federal rules of evidence is entirely inapplicable to evaluating prejudice under Rule 37E. Ezra continues, the Wayfarer parties are responsible for the Wallace party's spoliation. The Wayfarer parties attempt but fail to relieve themselves of responsibility for the Wallace party's spoliation. Courts in this circuit have held that a party may be liable for spoliation based on the actions of a non-party within his or her control. Here, the relationship between Wayfarer and the Wallace parties supports a similar common sense finding that the Wallace party's ephemeral communications were within Wayfarer's control. Among other things, Wayfarer hired the Wallace parties to support Wayfarer's crisis PR team. Wayfarer paid the Wallace parties for their redacted. Wayfarer and the Wallace parties share the same counsel. Liner, Friedman, Tatelman, and Cooley, LLP. Mr. Friedman has been the Wallace party's lawyer, redacted. Wayfarer is redacted, and since at least August 11th, 2024, Wayfarer knew of Wallace's use of Signal. As such, the Wayfarer parties should remain liable for the Wallace party's separate spoliation. Defendants intended to deprive Miss Lively of discoverable evidence. Footnote: in their opposition, the Wayfarer parties commit two separate sections to addressing the requisite intent for sanctions under Rule 37E2. Miss Lively addresses these arguments together. Defendants ignore almost entirely the evidence presented by Miss Lively that demonstrates their intentional use of ephemeral communications as part of their untraceable plan. Instead, they point to steps they took to preserve signal communications after December 20th, 2024, as disproving the notion that they acted with culpable intent. Defendants admit that they were always capable of preserving these communications, but only began taking the appropriate preservation steps once the lawsuit was filed. This does not excuse them of wrongdoing, but is in fact further proof of their conscious dereliction of a known duty to preserve electronic data. Further, the unrebutted record unequivocally demonstrates that defendants acted with the requisite level of intent for purposes of Rule 37E2 sanctions. Ephemeral communications existed and would have been relevant to this dispute. Defendants took no steps to preserve their ephemeral communications despite anticipating litigation, and there is no credible explanation for the lost ephemeral communications as not involving bad faith. The timing of defendants' use of signal communications removes all doubt. as to bad faith. By mid-August 2024, defendants knew litigation was reasonably foreseeable and made the deliberate decision to then communicate through ephemeral channels. In fact, they expressly acknowledged the need to cover their tracks, knowing that documenting their actual work could get us in a lot of trouble. This demonstrates bad faith. If defendants were truly engaged, okay, I think this is a solid point. If defendants were truly engaged in run-of-the-mill PR work, there would be no reason to think that their activities, if exposed, could have gotten them in a lot of trouble. Okay, that is the most sense they've made in this entire memorandum of law, and possibly in months. Let me read it one more time. If defendants were truly engaged in run-of-the-mill PR work, there would be no reason to think that their activities, if exposed, could have gotten them in a lot of trouble. Instead, their own documents confirm that an integral part of the crisis management strategy was that it be executed without fingerprints. Defendants used ephemeral communications as part of their retaliatory digital campaign as to avoid being used against them as part of a legal claim. This is precisely the type of misconduct Rule 37E2 is intended to address. For the foregoing reasons, Ms. Lively's motion for spoliation sanctions should be granted. And anything could happen. This judge has been in her pocket mostly, repeatedly, over and over again, with the odd exception here and there. Penn Badgley's ex-girlfriend filed a lot of exhibits with this memorandum of law, filed under seal, filed under seal, filed under seal, filed under seal, filed under seal. Oh, this one's not filed under seal. Text, not signal communications between Justin Baldoni and his friends, including actor Rainn Wilson. We've seen this before. Also, a little bit of Jamie Heath's deposition. We've seen this before as well, talking about the timeline that we discussed previously that Heath had somebody at Wayfarer put together. Plus, filed under seal. 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 And, a declaration of Ezra Hudson in further support of Plaintiff Blake Lively's motion for spoliation sanctions. A PS. And with regards to the related litigation, which, you know what I said, remember, you know what I remember? You know what I said? Coordination, who's paying whose bills. Jones focuses on Abel. I'm only going to read the introduction because I don't care about Stephanie Jones. Her lawyer argues, Jennifer Abel destroyed critical evidence while anticipating litigation and now asks this court to excuse that destruction with semantics and selective memory. Her opposition fails on every ground. Abel redacted, yet claims her duty to preserve extended only to redacted allegations, not to the public relations campaign launched specifically to counter those very allegations. This artificial distinction collapses under the slightest scrutiny. The PR campaign was conceived for one purpose: to shape the narrative surrounding the on-set conduct that Abel contemporaneously believed would spawn litigation. Communications about that campaign, including whether Abel's own employer JonesWorks participated or even knew about it, were plainly relevant to any anticipated dispute. Abel did not preserve those records, spoliating relevant evidence. Abel redacted, yet Abel produced not a single signal message prior to December 2024. I'm going to guess Abel testified that she used Signal in August of 2024. The reason is obvious that she did not produce anything prior to December 2024. She and her collaborators enabled Signal's auto-delete feature to ensure these communications would vanish. Abel's attempt to characterize the missing messages as cumulative misses the point entirely. The existing evidence shows Jones and JonesWorks were excluded from the campaign. The Signal messages would have shown that Abel deliberately concealed her actions, operated outside her authority, and aligned herself with a client's interests against her employers. That evidence goes to the heart of Abel's indemnification claim and her defense that she acted within the scope of her employment. Abel's redacted and her inability to explain the disappearance of all pre-December 2024 messages reflects bad faith. This is precisely the conduct Rule 37E2 sanctions are designed to address. Gonna skim through this. Abel's duty to preserve was triggered before the Signal messages disappeared. Abel's principal argument that she was not required to preserve her Signal messages because she anticipated litigation about redacted in 2023, but not litigation about the PR campaign in 2024, is incorrect as a matter of law and fact. Abel admitted that redacted, those allegations are the very reason the PR campaign existed. The PR campaign Abel seeks to characterize as unrelated was conceived solely to influence the narrative surrounding those misconduct allegations. The distinction Abel now draws is artificial and unavailing. Abel cannot plausibly claim that PR work designed to manage anticipated litigation fallout was irrelevant to that litigation. Moreover, Abel's timeline... I'm skipping here. I got you. I got me too. I'm like, Jesus. Anytime I have to talk about Stephanie Jones, my blood boils. Stephanie Jones is a boil on the butt of humanity. You can quote me on that. Moreover, Abel's timeline is off base. She claims she could not have anticipated litigation over August 2024 public relations activities in November 2023 because those public relations activities had not yet occurred. But her duty to preserve did not end in November 2023. It continued and intensified as litigation became increasingly likely. Are we sure Ezra did not write this? By August 2024, when Abel was actively using Signal to coordinate PR strategy and the foreseeability of litigation was undeniable. By that point, at the latest, her duty to preserve communications relating to that anticipated litigation attached, regardless of when those communications occurred. Abel's destroyed signal messages are highly relevant and not cumulative. Now this right here, this is very relevant. Abel's indemnification claim, remember, she's arguing, all I did under the employment of Jones Works. Therefore, Stephanie Jones should indemnify me. Smart. Abel's indemnification claim turns on whether she conducted the actions at issue in the Lively complaint in the course of her employment at Jones Works and at the direction of Jones Works. The destroyed signal messages would show she did not. They would show deliberate concealment. Abel's choice to use signal rather than normal business channels, okay, this is sensible also, indicates she knew she lacked authority and sought to hide her conduct from Jones. They would show decision-making by Abel, not Jones or Jones Works. The content would depict Abel alone setting strategy, coordinating with Nathan and Wallace, and directing the campaign without Jones's knowledge or approval. Fair. I remember in the depositions, I think it was Jamie Heath, possibly Jen Abel also, saying that after the whole brouhaha where Stephanie Jones allegedly contacted a reporter after being told not to, that Wayfarer said to stand down and did not include her in anything. And Steffi argues that the spoliated, the now non-existent signal communications would show personal benefit. The messages may reveal Abel's conspiracy to leave Jones Works. That part was not a conspiracy. The next part, I don't even think it is either. Take the Wayfarer account and continue working with Nathan. Evidence that she acted for herself, not for the company. This evidence goes to the heart of whether Abel was operating within the scope of her employment. Abel's use of signal to operate independent of the Jones Works platform and thus hide her activities from Jones is powerful evidence that she was not. The existing emails and text messages produced in this litigation show that Jones was excluded from the Wayfarer PR strategy. The signal messages would have shown how and why. They would have revealed that Abel consciously hid her actions from her employer, that she coordinated strategy that contradicted Jones's directives, and that she aligned herself with Wayfarer's interests rather than those of Jones Works. Those facts bear directly on whether Abel acted within the scope of her employment, the central issue in her indemnification claim. Y'all, once again, I'm having deja vu. This is not about spoliation. This is about the indemnification of it all. This is more than a PS. This is a plea and a begging, a telegraphing to the judge, you better get this right. You better rule on this other thing in my favor. I'm highlighting why this is so important. Your Honor, your sexy and smart self. The signal messages would also show that Abel affirmatively chose to use an ephemeral messaging platform to coordinate work for Jones's own client behind Jones's back. This goes directly to Abel's state of mind, her intent to conceal her activities, and whether she was acting within or outside the scope of her employment. Abel's conduct reveals bad faith. Redacted strains credulity given the documentary evidence showing redacted, and her purported justification that Signal was chosen for security reasons to protect against hackers and aggressive media players does not explain why the auto-delete feature was necessary, particularly when Abel knew she had a duty to preserve these communications for anticipated litigation. The far more plausible explanation is that Abel and her co-conspirators chose Signal precisely because it would make their coordination disappear without a trace. The court should therefore impose sanctions under Rule 37E2, including an adverse inference and preclusion as requested. For the foregoing reasons, Jones Works LLC respectfully requests that the court enter an order granting Jones Works' motion for Rule 37E sanctions in its entirety. XOXO. No, I added that, you know. These two white women. Sorry if any white woman felt attacked there, but I'm sure that most white women also would say, these two white women. It's just all so ridiculous, right? That's why we're here. That's why we're still here. Even with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, I don't think things were this crazy. I mean, they were crazy there. Well, I appreciate you being along for the ride, and I appreciate everybody who's gotten a cameo from me. I've got a special holiday sale. For a limited time only, you can get personalized videos from me at a discount. Book one right now on the Cameo website at cameo.com/P to the E to the R to the E to the Z to the H to the I to the L T to the N. Cameo.com/my name. Also, check out my merch at buypopstuff.com. That's buypopstuff.com. Read my website every day throughout the day to stay informed and be entertained. Perez, that's me. Hilton, also me.com. If you like our podcast, you will love the Patreon. We give you all an exclusive episode a week and are super hands-on, chatting with you all every day on the message board. Sign up right now at patreon.com/my name. Thank you again. If you watched until the very end, you are the 1%. Most people don't watch until here. Hit that like button, share this video, and say in the comments section, Stevie. Because why not? We need more Stevie, less Blakey. Say Stevie in the comments section. Thoughts on all of this? We covered a lot of ground. There were a couple of moments where she and the other Bruja Blanca made sense. But for the most part, full of caca. Let's discuss it all. You know where. Say Stevie, and I'll see you there.